Coming up next, the sick power games of a girl and the weirdos in her life. Hey everybody, welcome to the Bookening. My name is Nathan Iverson. I am your humble and obedient host. Joining you if this is your first time, then I'd like to welcome you to the Bookening, a Christian literature podcast. Of course, we don't mean Left Behind. We don't mean Christian literature, do we, Brandon? We don't mean books published by Tyndale House or Crossway. We mean literature in general. What's that? Zondervan, yes. We mean literature in general as
read through the eyes of a Christian.
Read through the eyes of a Christian. Specifically, three Christians. Me.
Specifically, our eyes.
Our eyes, yes.
6 eyes.
6 eyes. Sometimes ears. Some of us do audiobooks occasionally. Now, let me describe those eyes. You've got olive-colored.
Hazel.
Hazel. Is it hazel? Yeah.
They are hazel.
You've got black, piercing eyes set back in the skull.
Yes.
Whose skull? Brandon Chastain's, the scholar who's a baller of reading, PhD, ABD. He brings the intellect to our podcast. And he's leaving. Oh, he's throwing away his gum. Now, wearing a very fine pair of tortoise-shell glasses.
Indeed.
Over his eyes, the aforementioned eyes, we've got the man that brings the heart to the podcast and also the pastoral wisdom. Pastoral, you say? Do I mean like fields with grass?
Well, of course you do.
Romantic sweeping vistas.
Sorry, I just
definitely.
got an image of us as Scarecrow, Tin Man, and the Lion.
Nope. I mean pastoral, like he's a pastor. Specifically, Pastor Jacob Menzel, the pastor who's a master of reading.
What's up?
How you doing, Jake?
Good.
Excited to talk about the first really exciting book that we've done ever? That's not true. That's a wild exaggeration.
I would contradict that statement.
Are you ready to talk about the book that reminded me that I like reading?
I can get behind that statement myself.
And also may or may not be trash.
Yes, I could also get behind that statement.
Yes.
Yes, I'm ready to talk about this book. I enjoyed almost every minute of reading it. It's a large book.
Mm-hmm.
I flew through it.
Yeah.
And had fun. And it may or may not also be trash.
Well, the cumulative effect is questionable at best.
Indeed.
Maybe answerable with A+, but maybe answerable with F-.
We're going to have to talk about it.
I think we should talk about it. I think we should do several podcasts.
I think we should too.
This is going to be fun. We're going to have Danny on, our resident token female.
Old dubstep herself.
We're going to have her on in a few episodes. I think we're going to do a couple episodes. I don't know how many. We're going to do some just the boys.
Nice.
But then we're going to have Danny on so she can give her unique perspective. And that should be interesting because being a woman, I could see Danny having a different perspective. I could see her thinking that men actually act like Mr. Rochester.
Well, I don't want to deny that they act that way. I just want to deny that they deserve to be the heroes of a romance novel like this one.
You know, there's just a lot of other things that I'm getting married right now, you guys, right? Like, yeah. I've got a fiance. I love her a lot. I think she's fantastic. I think she's beautiful. I like her personality. Everything about her I like. But I do not spend every waking moment of every day mooning over her and feeling like I'm going to die.
You should probably repent and be more like Mr. Rochester.
I probably should be more like Mr. Rochester. I'm thinking that's the lesson. Or more like St. John, which is how he was pronounced in the audiobook, by the way. St. John.
Oh, St. John.
Yeah, old St. John. All right, Brandon, we'll talk about old St. John.
That's what I'm going to call him this whole time.
I mean, I'm probably going to call him St. John because I'm used to St. John, but it's okay. We have all types.
That's how they pronounced him?
All right, guys, let's get into it. Let's stop wasting time, Brandon. All Nathan, I wanted to do is talk about Spiridanes and Days Gone By.
Hey, there we go.
Now we're back on track. Now we're back on track. That's always a good way to reorient. All right, what happens next is what's that sound?
Oh no, it's the mysterious phantom showing up.
No, it's Mr. Rochester calling to me across the heath.
Yes. Jane. No. That was the sound of Brandon Chastain, the contextual Texan. He's firing off his pistols. If people don't know, this, if people don't know this segment from our show, this is the segment where Brandon, he's from Texas. He's going to provide some much needed context for this work.
Yeehaw.
So with a hail and hearty yeehaw, as he just did.
Well, I was telling Nathan that we've actually provided context for this book through quite a few of the other episodes we've done. Mm-hmm. In particular, the episode on Mary Shelley, and then have we done, the episodes on Dickens, and
surely the episodes on Austen.
And also the episodes on, what are some of the Gothic literature we've done?
Well, Dracula. We probably touched on.
That's where we
least.
did most with the Gothic.
Yeah.
And so all those elements come into play with this novel. And so to get us started, a bit of bio, but also I think it's interesting to just put her into literary context. And she's after the Romantics. She would have been writing, she was born after the end of Austen's career, just a couple of years after that. She was born in 1816. So she was after the Romantics and after Austen. So she was in the Victorian era. And you can see some of the Victorianism in the way she writes and in her high-mindedness. Mm-hmm. There was in particular one word at the end of the novel she used when she was talking about St. John. What did you say he was?
We should just get this out of the way early. St. John in my audiobook is how they pronounce the guy that you might think, if you're a moron, is pronounced St. John.
It's this word master spirit. She called him a master spirit. What philosopher used that word?
Somebody from the era?
Well, you would see the word master spirit come into vogue with guys like Nietzsche and stuff later on, guys who had like the Übermensch mentality. There were some German philosophers like...
if you search master spirit in quotes, the top result is what are master spirits in Super Smash Bros. Ultimate?
Oh.
And the second top result is Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, all master spirits and how to unlock.
Well, that must be the secret right there.
They're all Smash Brothers, all of them.
Yeah.
The whole first page.
Yeah, what I'm thinking is it was the Phenomenology of Spirit by Hegel. Anyways,
I prefer Smash Brothers.
Yeah. What I was thinking of was the Phenomenology of Spirit by Friedrich von Hegel. Anyways, this would have been the period of philosophy where you were moving towards what would become like transcendental philosophy in America with Emerson and those guys, with the transcendental movement, which transcendental, incidentally, would be happening around the same time that she would be writing. And it was this fierce move towards individualism and towards expressing yourself in this spiritualism that was quasi-Christian, but was really just about your ability to come in contact with the great high spirit.
High spirits, quasi-transcendental individualism and expressing yourself individualistically. Brandon, I don't see what this has to do with the novel.
You don't see any of this in Jane Eyre? Oh, this is just a simple love story.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, you get hints of this early on in the book with Helen Burns, with the way that she talks about spirituality.
Yeah.
And how she was just wants to be of like one concourse with this great mind that imbues everything, right? And sort of in these quasi-visions that she gets of this higher reality. You had this with the Romantic poets. So Keats had his famous expression of negative capability, where you would try and, through forgetting yourself and through just intense emotion, have the ability to just completely forget yourself and become one with like the transcendental. And that was the big word. And that's why in America, when those philosophers would take over, it would be the transcendental movement. It was how can you transcend yourself through individualism, through self-reliance, all these things to get at some higher truth. And the master spirit, and from what I remember of Hegel, and there was a famous playwright that wrote The Robbers. Who wrote The Robbers? Look that up. Yeah, that's the name I was trying to remember. Schiller. So he was an early proponent of this. And then you'd have guys like Faust by Goethe, and they would all be about the Sturm und Drang. And this would be in the intellectual environment of England at the time, the intense emotion that could lead you to truth, right? And so this would then seep over into England with the Romantics. You would have this counter movement, which we talked about in depth with Mary Shelley, that would be very antithetical to everything that Jane Austen, and even to an extent, nobody can see my hand movements but I have very animated hand movements right now.
To a large extent, his hands are telling us right now, folks.
Austen is on the right of me. Mary Shelley and her crew are on the left of me with the master spirits. And then you have quiet Austen in her writing room. And so you have to understand the intellectual environment that is happening at this time in England, but that kind of preceded Charlotte Bronte to an extent. This all was happening in the early 1800s. Hegel would have been early 1800s. Goethe wrote Faust, late 1700s, right? So this was already there. Mary Wollstonecraft had already fought her battles. The Romantics had already had their licentious day in the sun. So Charlotte Bronte was inheriting this sort of mentality. All right. So there's...
I'm sorry, I really enjoyed the phrase, licentious day in the sun.
You're welcome.
I think that should be the name of your autobiography.
A licentious day in the sun.
The Brandon Chastain story.
Oh, boy. So...
It's 3 days, the day's gone by. I almost missed it.
I know.
Thank
I
you
was
for
about
pausing.
to move on.
Thank you for pausing.
We're here, then, in the 1816s, in the Victorian era now. But we still have these thoughts, this ideology that is formed. And Charlotte Bronte is going to be squarely in this form of ideology. She's not going to be just your happy theatrical storyteller like Dickens, who was her contemporary, oddly enough. Or even Mark Twain was her contemporary as well.
That's interesting.
You had a lot of like Hawthorne would have been writing at the same time. All the great American Melville with Moby Dick would have been writing pretty much around the same era. So a lot of great things were happening in literature at this period all over the world. Tolstoy was coming. He was just around the corner.
Tolstoy's coming.
And boy, is he going to teach all of them how to write.
Yeah, if only.
If only. So then if we just go by this chronology that is handily here in front of me, she was born in 1816. She was the third child of Patrick and Maria Bronte, born at Thornton, Yorkshire.
Thornton, eh?
Thornton.
Interesting.
Yes. Dun, dun, dun. Omens.
Jane.
Oldest surviving of 3 sisters. They had an older sister named Maria, but she died while they were young. They had a brother, Branwell. Maria was the first to die, and she died of tuberculosis. And then Branwell would also die of tuberculosis later on, but he would survive into their early adulthood. Where was this? Their father was a curate, and the name of the curacy, the house that they lived in was, where was it? Haworth. And it was a very happy home for them. In a way, similar to what we think of with Jane Austen's early childhood. There was a lot of intellectual exploration. I hate that word. What's a better way to put it?
A lot of...
education. They were educated well. There we go. And like their brother, for example, he got a box of toy soldiers, and they used that to write a play. They were writing stories. They were...
Was Branwell's soldiers?
Yeah. And so... But her other sisters were Emily and...
Emily wrote Wuthering Heights. Who's the other one? Anne. And she did something too, right?
Yes, she was also a writer. All 3 of these would become famous writers in their own right. Charlotte and Emily, arguably more famous than Anne. But
arguably, huh?
Arguably, yeah.
One could argue.
They would write novels that would shape English literature. Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights. I really don't know if either of Charlotte's other works can be considered that groundbreaking. You have Villette, you have The Master, but...
Yeah, I know some people like them, but I've never read them or talked to anyone who has.
I've read Villette, but...
Have you? Okay.
Yeah.
How'd you manage to read Villette and not read Jane Eyre?
Who knows?
It's just the travails of a PhD.
I guess. Yeah, I had to read it for a class once. So... I mean, really, that's...
3 days ago,
She had it's a strange biography because she had a very quiet life. They grew up in Haworth together. And around the early 1840s, so she was born in 1816, the early 1840s, using some money from an aunt, a fairly wealthy aunt, they would go to Brussels, where they were a governess in a small French school. And this French school was overseen by an intellectual family that had been influential in some of the Belgian revolutions and stuff, and especially the husband was kind of the superstar intellectual in the school. He taught rhetoric, but he was ugly, bit of a dark character, prone to fits of rage and anger, but then can also be witty and charming and charismatic. And guess what young Charlotte did?
Fall in love?
She fell in love with him, as best we can tell. With her letters and stuff, if you read some of her letters, she was always obsessed and infatuated with this man, talking about him. It's pretty clear that he is an early influence, or he is an influence for Mr. Rochester. Now, this man's wife did not take very kindly. She was the madam of the school. She was the headmistress. She did not take very kindly to this young English woman falling in love with her husband, and so was
she a mad Creole?
She wasn't a mad Creole
lady.
She was actually a fairly friendly, charismatic woman in her own right. you get these, what was that one with Francis Schaeffer, that school he started?
Oh, what is that place? What is it?
Kind of sounded like that sort of place where you would come in, you could be a governess. And so Charlotte would teach English. Later she would teach English at this school.
This has been in kind of a progressive school for its time?
Yeah, a bit. But they went there and eventually when their aunt died, they had to go back to England. Emily was happy to go back because she didn't want to be there anyways, because Emily was kind of a recluse. And if you've ever read Wuthering Heights, that should not surprise you at all. Mm-hmm. Wuthering Heights is a very strange and dark novel compared to Jane Eyre, even though Jane Eyre in its own right is a very strange and dark novel too. But Wuthering Heights is the emo to Jane Eyre's not emo.
What would Jane Eyre be? I think we have to stop and figure this out. If Wuthering Heights is emo, what does that make Jane Eyre? Fantasy metal?
Yeah, fantasy metal.
It's like, no, Jane Eyre is like pop emo
and Wuthering Heights is like emo for people that actually like emo.
Yeah.
Like actual emo kids that aren't like posers listen to Wuthering Heights.
Yeah, it's like Jane Eyre's Dashboard Confessional, and then Wuthering Heights is some band that I've never heard of because I don't care about emo.
You don't care about emo.
There we go. So if you out there know who they would be, tweet at us.
Yep. Send a self-addressed postcard to Brandon Chest.
Yeah, there we go. Figure out where I live and send it there. So eventually, though, Charlotte would come back to the school. We don't know a whole lot of the history, but like he ended up taking her under his wing. He gave her like a piece of Napoleon's coffin.
This Rochester guy?
Yeah.
Give her a piece of Napoleon's coffin.
As a gift.
Brandon, nobody's ever given me a piece of Napoleon's coffin.
I'm sorry if I ever come across a piece of Napoleon's coffin. I will give it to you.
I appreciate that.
It was during one of the long summer breaks here when the family was away and she was there and she was isolated that she began to write in these stories that the lessons she had learned as a child, the instincts that she had shown as a child towards storytelling and all this. She began to write some stories, and it would be over this period she wrote what was her first novel, but then also in the margins she wrote of this house, this old ugly house above a river in England, old manor house that had fallen into disrepair and was full of like this memory of some story, but nobody really missed the house. And that was the first instance we get of what would later become
Thornwell.
Thornwell, that's right.
Thornwell.
But that would be the first instance we would get of Jane Eyre, would be in the margins of this other story that she was writing. And she even said that she liked to be telling multiple stories at once. So she was always telling many stories at one time. She was also a poet. She wrote some poems and sent them to this, one of the famous poets at the time was Southey, Robert Southey. And he wrote her back saying, really, it's not a woman's place to be taken up with literary concerns.
Ouch. Wow.
And apparently, that's actually in the front of this introduction I have here. We can actually read it. Yeah, she sent her early poems to the poet laureate Robert Southey. He wrote back to tell her literature cannot be the business of a woman's life. And she says, in the evenings I do think, but I never trouble anyone else with my thoughts. I trust I shall never more feel ambitious to see my name in print. If the wish should rise, I'll look at Southey's letter and suppress it.
So she actually felt like, oh, well, I guess Southey's got a point.
Yeah, and so she was going to suppress it, but then she went off to school at this progressive Brussels school and decided, well, maybe I'll be a writer after all. And so she gets her first novel published, moderate acclaim. Then she gets Jane Eyre published in 1847. The rest is history. She changes English letters.
It was an immediately sweeping success? Is that what you're saying?
No, it's not an immediate sweeping success. It wasn't that. I don't believe it was that huge.
In some of the notes in my book, it talked about a lot of the negative press that the book got.
Yeah. Well, and we will talk about that here in a minute because the book itself is about, but that'll be when we kind of get to the Gothic elements of it and what she's doing with that. There was a lot of negative press. And actually, if you look at history, negative press often leads to a book being quite popular. Mm-hmm. Because if it's negative for the reasons that this book was negative, people are going to want to read it. And one of the reasons this book got negative press was because of the sexual stuff.
Right.
The desire that was in every page. People thought that was a bit much.
Yeah.
So did you have some of these reviews that you thought were worth reading?
So the quarterly review said, we do not hesitate to say that the tone of mind and thought which has overthrown authority and violated every code, human and divine, abroad, and fostered Chartism, whatever that is, and rebellion at home, is the same which has also written Jane Eyre.
Every page burns with moral Jacobinism, the Christian remembrancer. Quote, a proud and perpetual assertion of the rights of man and ungodly discontent. Elizabeth Rigby, Review of Vanity Fair and Jane Eyre.
Okay,
so, yeah, this commenter says the threatening tone of this manifesto, speaking of chapter 12, how it begins, placing women's rebellious feelings within the larger context of social unease in 1840s Britain affronted conservative reviewers.
Yeah. So it was a bit of a scandal. And her first novel, The Professor, didn't do quite as well. I think I called it The Master earlier. But I think that was the early transcript of it, was called The Master. So when it was published, it was The Professor. But Jane Eyre was a commercial success pretty early on, particularly because of these sort of conservative debates that surrounded the feminism of it and this overt sexuality of the book that, even though it seems tame to us, to the Victorians, who are notorious for not being
The most
overt,
progressive people in the world.
yeah, it was kind of scandalous. But then there was also this other fact that the author wrote under a pseudonym. And I think that this is something that most people don't realize about the Brontes, is that when they originally published their novels, the sisters did not write them under the name Bronte.
Was it? Are they Kerr, Bell, and Ives or something like that?
So when Jane Eyre came out, it was written by a Kerr or Bell. And so one of the debates surrounding the book was, well, was this written by a man or was this written by a woman? You had some people like criticizing her portrayal of Lady Ingram, saying that there was something that happened with like the way that she placed the table. That person said, well, a woman would have never made that mistake. So this must have been written by a man.
No, any idiot would know this is written. The cattiness with which she portrays some of the females and the weird, crazy wish fulfillment with which she portrays the men, this is definitely written by a woman.
So you had Kerr Bell. Then quickly following on this, you had Wuthering Heights come out. And that was by her sister, Emily, and she published under Ellis Bell. So even more speculation. Who are these Bells? And then after that, you had Agnes Grey, which was by the sister Anne, Acton Bell, and then all three sisters together in fairly short succession became well-known authors. And then by 1848, both Emily and Anne were dead.
It's like something that would happen in one of their novels.
Yeah. This is a strange biography, like I said, because really the highlights of Charlotte's life were a fairly happy childhood at their father's curacy, where they had the liveliness of theatrical performances. They would write poetry together. They had their brother, who was apparently charming and fun when he was young, but as he got older, he became addicted to opium and kind of became a reprobate, and then he died of tuberculosis as well. And then he had Maria, who died of tuberculosis. They become fairly successful authors, very successful authors in the case of Emily and Charlotte, and then immediately Emily dies of tuberculosis, and then Anne dies of tuberculosis, and that leaves Charlotte alone. And eventually she gets married about 6 years later to one of her father's friends, and then 9 months later she dies of what we think were pregnancy complications. And so a fairly short life. She died at 39, but she managed to write what is arguably one of the most famous works of literature. I mean, it's had many film adaptations. Most people know the story of Jane Eyre.
Sure.
Yeah, it's a short bio. So it is important to know that she probably didn't actually live long enough to reach the levels of fame that Dickens had. I mean, Dickens was a legitimate superstar, but I don't even think she really reached the heights of fame that like a George Eliot would have had, for example.
Right.
But she was respected and she was well known, and Jane Eyre caused a bit of a scandal, and people admired the story. They thought that it was a good novel in the traditions of the novels at the time. And if you want to, you can go and read some of these reviews. They're fascinating to see the debates that surrounded Jane Eyre. And now, why did the debate surround Jane Eyre? Well, we talked about the sort of philosophical, ideological background to the book. We've also in the past talked about the sort of literary influences, but let's just kind of recap those. This book is obviously in the tradition of the English novel at the time, as Lady Austen firmly founded it, and others following in her footsteps and in that tradition would continue to grow it and expand it. And it's books about class and power, about how does class and station affect your ability to have love, who you can marry, who you can't marry, and how does that affect the human drama. And that kind of, if you really want to encapsulate what the English twist on the novel is, that is the English twist on the novel. I mean, even Dickens, with Great Expectations, Bleak House, all these stories. Esther Summerson's narrative really is a narrative about who can she be, right? And so the Brits are just obsessed. Even think about Ishiguro with Remains of the Day. Sure. He's still following in that tradition. That is the British novel, is thinking about those sorts of questions. And obviously that's in Jane Eyre. Right? That's the big question until finally she, instead of the man, she comes into her fortune with her 20,000 that she gets from her Uncle John, who we never meet. But the question of how does your station limit who you are and who you can be? That's the English novel, very different than the American novel, if you think about it. And maybe one day we'll get a chance. We really haven't done too many of the great American novels yet, have we? And so you had the proponents of this, who actually were friends of Charlotte Bronte. So the book, when it was first published, was published in 3 parts. And that should be familiar to anyone who's listened to our Dickens episodes. But novels at the time were often serialized. And so this was published in 3 parts. But then when it was published again, because it got a second publication because it was so successful, she dedicated it to... You remember who? William Makepeace Thackeray, who was a good friend of hers and an admirer of her work as well.
Vanity Fair, Thackeray.
Yeah, and one day we'll read Vanity Fair.
Yeah, I'd love to.
But he was Dickens' rival. It's basically, if you want to know who Thackeray was, he was Dickens' fiercest rival outside of Wilkie Collins. So, and Vanity Fair is great. But they would have been, and Gaskell was her other friend.
Elizabeth Gaskell.
Yeah, who wrote North and South. And Elizabeth Gaskell and Thackeray, they were proponents and masters of this version of the English novel. So you have that influence on Jane Eyre. But then sort of the underbelly, the seedy side of it, you have the Gothic romance.
Mm-hmm.
The Gothic romance was heavily influenced by some of the art that would come out of that sort of Sturm und Drang that we talked about with the German philosophical influences.
Mm-hmm.
This tendency towards fierce individualism and pride and self-reliance.
Mm-hmm.
What that would lead to would be these moody set pieces that were just about some heroine who would be thrown into a situation that was dangerous and where her love interest was also maybe dangerous, but that would maybe be rectified in the end and maybe end in marriage. That would be the romantic aspect to it. The Gothic element would add a house,
right?
Often a large house, a manor house that was dangerous and large and frightening. And you have these elements in Jane Eyre from the very beginning with the Red Room, right? That she's put into this room as a child, and where she thinks that there might be a ghost that's coming in.
Yeah, I've read some, back in my emo days, I read some Gothic novels. I don't remember what it was. So Anne Radcliffe, Matthew Lewis, I don't know, Castle of Ontario, that kind of stuff. And what I would say is it's kind of the same thing. You just have to remove 3-dimensional characters and you have to remove any real agency from the female. So if you just imagine Jane as a really passive young ingenue that just kind of is thrown upon the world and ends up in the clutches of a monstrous relative or other, noblemen in a mysterious castle, and there's clanking chains and forbidden rooms and all that kind of stuff. This is like the psychologically real, much more well-developed, interesting 3-dimensional version of a pretty cheesy genre.
And the vampire story came out of this sort of, or at least Bram Stoker's take on it did.
Sure.
There would be ghosts and there would be these sorts of things in the Gothic romance that you don't necessarily get in Jane Eyre until you get to some of the weirdness that happens towards the end of the book with her hearing his voice somehow from miles and miles away.
I'd say Jane Eyre is actually, there are famous Gothic novels that do have, this strain of really romantic, weird supernaturalism, but a lot of them, like Anne Radcliffe, it's all introduced, the clanking chains, but then it's all explained away Scooby-Doo style. Jane Eyre is actually a little bit more, has more spiritualism and more weirdness than a lot of the classic Gothic novels actually do.
Yeah, and she tries to explain away most of it. So the voice that she hears turns out to just be Bertha, the crazy wife.
Right.
What else? Oh, the gypsy's not actually a gypsy. It's just Mr. Rochester in disguise.
Yeah, but then she takes that weird left turn at the end with the telepathy.
Yes, but she does do that.
Right.
So there's some weirdness in this book, but this is all from this Gothic
and all
influence.
The dreams.
Yeah, and all the dreams. And I mean, she basically foresees what's going to happen to her Edward, doesn't she?
Yeah, I mean, she sees the place in ruins and burning. And she has a couple of pretentious dreams and has this whole thing about dreaming of children and why that's bad and how that pretends something. And
yeah, I think she really wants to have her cake and eat it too and play with these themes without really committing. And I think she actually does a pretty good job of, I would say, we'll talk about it, I suppose, but I think she does a good job of introducing the supernatural without committing to it.
Yeah, I think you're right.
I mean, but I don't know whether that's a worthy goal, but insofar as it is, she pulls it off, I'd say.
Yeah, but inarguably, you have all the elements of a Gothic in this novel.
Yes.
They're not as intense as you have in, for example, Wuthering Heights, where they're like escalated to 11.
Mm.
But this is definitely Gothic in a sense. And it's a romance in a sense, too. The other Gothic element would be the character of Mr. Rochester. And so what the Gothic would add to the romance would be that the romantic interest would not only be Darcy and his moodiness, but he would also have a legitimately sinister wickedness that was possible to destroy you.
Mm-hmm.
This wickedness, like a sin, something that you shouldn't quite look at.
Right.
And obviously with Rochester, there's some gnarly stuff going on in his past.
Well, then again, she wants to have her cake and eat it too. She wants to introduce this element and use it and let us experience the potency, but she doesn't actually want Rochester to be stuck with the moral agency like a good old-fashioned mustache twirling Gothic villain would actually be, just have an evil secret. And Rochester kind of does, but I will get into it. I'll stop analyzing you, Brennan.
You have the Gothic, you have the English, just traditional novel, and then you also have an element of the spiritual autobiography. In fact, this is called, in some instances, this is called Jane Eyre, an autobiography. And what that is it shares in the sort of Bildungsroman, which that's just following the growth of a hero through his trials and tribulations that turn him into the hero that he is. And so this is Jane Eyre's, the mature Jane Eyre, looking back on her life and telling you how she got to this point. So there are portions of the book where she will turn and address the reader, or she'll then reflect on what she wished she had known at that point.
Right.
One of the famous examples is when she's talking to Mrs. Reed early on. She's like, well, I wish now that I could have back the way I treated her. But the spiritual autobiography is where you get into the elements of the book that, besides the Gothic romance, that did provide some scandal. Spiritual autobiography, where Charlotte Bronte is letting some of her philosophy come into Jane Eyre and speak through Jane Eyre, is where you get some of the controversial stuff, where she pulls out some of her Mary Wollstonecraft and puts it into the book. Now, to remind people who Mary Wollstonecraft was, she was Mary Shelley's mother, and she was famous for writing her treatise on the rights of women, an early proto-feminist. And while Charlotte Bronte, what's interesting about the Bronte sisters is I guess what's interesting in general about when we do these contexts is sometimes you'll have authors who are just wholeheartedly part of a movement and identify themselves with a movement. So Mary Shelley would have been that way. She saw herself as part of the Romantic movement. And even though she might not have called herself a romantic, she was right there with Shelley. She was right there with Byron. They were in this world together where they were creating a very specific kind of art.
And doing it intentionally.
Then you get other creators, like Shakespeare didn't see himself as creating the Elizabethan drama. And he wasn't like leading Ben Jonson and these guys in this endeavor to create the Elizabethan drama as we see it today. And Dickens really wasn't like thinking of himself as the Victorian novelist. He was just a writer. And the Brontes were, to an extent, that's what they were. They weren't a part of some bigger movement that was happening at the time. That said, Bronte still was political to an extent and saw herself as limited by her circumstances and was aware of how her situation in life, probably bitterness towards what she couldn't have with that professor that she wanted, limitations as to what it meant to be the daughter of a curate, all these things. And you can read her letters and stuff and see this sort of disappointment. We read one of her letters when we did our Austen context, right? We're comparing Austen's contentment with her life and station and the way that Austen would just playfully accept criticism and just let it kind of roll off her, where it kind of riled up Charlotte Bronte and made her mad. Like, how dare you? This sort of fierce individualism did seep into her life, and it came out in her letters, and obviously it came out in this book. And you see it all over the place. The most famous example would be chapter 12.
Yeah.
But then also
it's just all over the place.
We should remind people what happens in chapter 12.
Well, chapter 12 is where she first meets Adele, and she talks about how she didn't really like Adele.
Right.
So,
what's the word? She chides the reader for assuming that they developed this sentimental relationship. And she's like, nah, it was nice, but nah.
Which, I mean, I'm sure we'll talk about this chapter.
People call it a manifesto, proto-feminist manifesto.
Yeah. I mean, and to be fair, I agree with some of the things she says about how they sentimentalized children at the time.
Sure.
Yeah, I actually don't mind. In and of itself, taken out of context, the context of her life, just accepting it as the character's thoughts, I don't actually mind that chapter all that much. But
you see it there, but then you also you see it in the fact that she's trying to mix Christian sentiment with this sort of heady world spirit German philosophy that influenced the Romantics and all of that brand of elite art at the time. I think one of the points you see it clearest in this book is when Rochester finally looks at her watercolors and we get to see what she's been painting.
Yeah.
And boy, howdy, those paintings were weird.
Wacko stuff.
Yeah. It's like what you would expect. It's actually similar to so last context we talked about the Pre-Raphaelites and their sort of intense colors and weird motifs they would do. It's very similar to that. And it shouldn't be surprising because one thing I haven't mentioned from their past, and I've actually saved to this point, is that one thing that they read a lot in their house was Byron and Shelley and the Romantics. They were very influential on her childhood. So even though she was not a part of the Romantic movement, she was heavily influenced by the Romantics and by their sort of individualism, by their sort of free spirit attitude, by their belief in the power of imagination to lead to truth. And I think that's important for Jane Eyre because I saw that all over the place with her insistence on dreams, her insistence on sort of speculative thought.
The spiritual yearning that goes along with nature. Jane will often go and look across the scenery and be stirred by the dark moors and
how this will somehow lead you to higher thought. And when she talks about this world spirit, the high spirit of Mr. St. John's, this is the sort of context you need to have in mind to make sense of it. And so then you get this young girl who's painting pictures like this.
I found them.
Yeah, you should read one.
Well, there's the sinking ship with corpses, and then there's the one where the woman's bust is filling the sky, and then there's the one where there's an iceberg and a head growing out of the iceberg.
Yeah, and so it's just these weird paintings that are reminiscent of the eerie sort of Gothic.
Yeah, it's very sort of almost impressionist.
Almost, when you just read it like that, it makes me think of Dali or something. That's
what I pictured. I was picturing more like Dali or
one of those guys.
Or like, but what it reminds me of too is like Shelley's poem
watercolors
on.
Yeah,
what's the Prometheus Unbound? You know, these sort of poems about great mythological figures.
Child Roland to the Dark Tower came.
And how through these big mythological figures we can make sense of our large mythological beings and how we're trapped and confined in these small spaces. And so what's weird about Jane Eyre, and I'm sure we'll talk about this more, is that I feel like this book is warring with itself because at one point it seemed to me like a Victorian spin on Jane Austen.
Right.
But then it's Jane Austen with the weird romantic unease and anxiety and unrest in it. And what you end up getting is this weird novel that kind of is butting its own head.
Yeah, that's a good way to put about it. I'm sure we will talk about that more. It really, just to the fact that her and Rochester can't actually be, they can be completely happy because they're soulmates, but he has to pay a price first, and he has to lose his eyesight, and he has to be scarred. Like, I don't know. That's weird. We'll talk about it, but what else you got to say?
I think that's pretty much it. We should talk about the fact that sort of some of the metaphors and tropes that come out of Jane Eyre have been heavily influential in feminist theory.
Really?
And in fact, people go back to our first episode ever and remember the flame war we started with someone who never is going to listen to us, Susan Gubar, an old professor from Indiana University, who is very, very famous in feminist circles. And she's famous because she wrote a book called, you know what it's called?
I do not.
The Mad Woman in the Attic.
Ah, yes.
And The Mad Woman in the Attic's famous because that essay postulates that what Bertha actually represents is Jane Eyre's subconscious that could never really come to the surface.
All the unfeminine things that she wants to express.
Yeah, so Bertha was Jane's double, the dark secret where she was imprisoned all her hunger, rebellion, and rage. The parts that escaped to assault Mrs. Reed, but thereafter learned, with role models like Miss Temple at Lowood, to subdue and so gain acceptance. And that's what this whole novel is about, is this dual nature of women. Until finally, have you ever heard of the book?
South Saragossa Sea?
Yeah, The Wide Sargasso Sea.
Yes, I have.
That book is it's a retelling of Bertha's story to try and make us sympathetic to her so that we don't...
It's from her point of view, and Rochester's mistreating her and not...
Yeah. And so she doesn't become that woman out of madness, but because she is the other that's always kept on the fringes of society. And so Bertha in particular has been a mine of treasures for feminist thinkers and post-colonial thinkers. Post-colonial thinkers are those who are saying that, we shouldn't just read white male authors. We should be looking at all these other authors who have always been silenced and quieted. And they're the ones who are going to go into the libraries and pull out weird books that no one's ever thought to read, often because they're bad.
Right. Suddenly we have to accept this random woman as part of the canon.
Yeah. That's why people have to read the yellow wallpaper now.
The yellow wallpaper's pretty good, isn't it?
No.
No, is it not?
I don't like the yellow
I remember it from
wallpaper.
childhood. I had to read it in junior high.
Maybe
or
it's
something.
fine, Nathan. I don't know.
I don't know. It's kind of creepy. You do actually keep your wife in a room with yellow wallpaper where she's not allowed to get out, right?
In the
She's
attic, yeah.
locked up, yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's fair.
Torture chamber has to have some purpose.
Mm-hmm. I'm with the feminists on this one. I think birth is pretty problematic.
Yes.
That's just a little
Just
spoiler
a little.
for next time.
But hey, she ends with her brains splattered all over the sidewalk.
Yep. A just dessert for a problematic woman that tried to usurp her place in the attic.
Who just so happened to be crazy.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's what happens when you have to put up with the patriarchy.
Yep. Drives you nuts.
Mm-hmm. Got anything else for us, Brandon?
No, that's it.
All right, guys, let's do some donor shout-outs and call it an episode. How are we going to do these donor shout-outs? Why don't
Quickly.
you do the donor shout-outs, and Jake, you say a bird that this person reminds you of. Robert and Rhonda, the lovebirds.
Robert and Rhonda, the lovebirds.
Condors.
Nice.
The immortal Chelsea E.
The immortal Chelsea E.
Swan.
Nathan, not me.
Nathan, not Nathan.
A duck.
Crack.
Jimmy Beam and little Annie Oakley.
Jimmy Beam and little Annie Oakley.
Penguins.
Lily of the Valley.
Lily of the Valley.
Ostrich.
Andrew and Esther, the lovebirds.
Andrew and Esther, the lovebirds.
Sparrows.
The inscrutable Jenny Z.
The inscrutable Jenny Z.
Turtle doves.
John and Jill, the lovebirds.
John and Jill, the lovebirds.
Robins.
Keith Master.
Keith Master.
Blue jay.
David's Mighty Man talking.
David's Mighty Men Trucking.
The
The albatross.
Guardians of
The
Gahul.
Albatross.
My beloved Mother Beth.
Nathan's beloved Mother Beth.
Parrot.
Did I say Jane? No, I didn't. Jane Katie, who are cold and love cheese.
Jane Katie, who are cold and love cheese.
English swallows.
Nice.
The Artful Anthony Dodger.
Artful Anthony Dodger.
African swallows.
The dark-hooded Lord of Death himself, Jeremy.
The dark-hooded Lord of Death himself. Jeremy.
Toucan.
The, speaking of toucan, two can get along better than one, like me and the incandescent Meredith.
The incandescent Meredith.
Woodpecker.
I don't know if I support that, Meredith, if you're listening. Jackie Jumpin' Joanna, the June bug.
Jackie Jumpin' Joanna the June Bug.
Hummingbird.
Can see we're still trying to land on that one.
So I've never been able to land. I'm sorry, Joanna. I love you. I cannot come up with something good for you. I'll keep working on it. I know I've come up with good ones previously and forgotten them. It's hard. Rockin' Ryan and Judo Judith.
Rockin' Ryan and Judo Judith.
Roadrunner.
Danny the Dude.
Danny the Dude.
Finch.
DJ Sammy D. DJ Sammy G.
DJ Sammy G.
Bird of paradise.
Benny and Dana T.
Benny and Dana T.
Seagull.
Eric and Catherine the Lovebird.
Eric and Catherine the Lovebirds.
Peacock.
Professor X and Lady X.
Professor X and Lady X.
And
Quail.
Oh, I'm sorry. What is it?
Quail.
Quail, of course. And Jake, I'm going to need a particularly good bird for our newest member of the donor shout out family, the ancient and venerable wizard of yore, Fletcher.
The ancient and venerable wizard of yore, Fletcher.
Cuckoo.
Hey,
Kookaburra.
welcome aboard, Fletcher. Say hi to Fletcher, guys.
Hey,
What's
Fletcher.
up, Fletcher? Thanks for supporting us.
Yeah, thank you, Fletcher.
I love you, Fletcher.
That's a good ending. All right, thanks for listening, everybody. This is Nathan again. That's Brandon. That's Jake. And if you want to support this work and if you want to get a grid donor shout out, what you do is you go to patreon.com/the Bookening. You sign up, pay at least $10. You'll get a donor shout out. Pay less than $10. You can still get some cool stuff. Do that. Do it today. We'll be back next week. I don't know if Danny, the not dude, will be joining us next week or the week after or what, but she's going to get into the mix here soon. And we'll be talking about ye old Jane Eyre and deciding whether it is awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Right, Brandon?
Right, Nathan.
Thanks for listening, everyone.